The gun was already pressed to her temple when Frank Hadley walked through the door. He had not expected this. He had ridden into Redemption, Texas on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882 with one singular purpose burning in his chest like a coal that would not go cold: to find the man who had stolen everything from him and make him answer for it. He had planned every move. He had rehearsed every word. He had not planned for the woman standing in the middle of the general store with her jaw set hard and her green eyes blazing, and a gun held to her head by a sweating, trembling man Frank recognized immediately. Cole Mercer, not the man Frank had come to find. Cole was a rat who ran errands for the man Frank had come to find, a rat with shaking hands and desperate eyes, and a secret Frank had not yet uncovered. "Back up," Cole said, his voice cracking in the middle of those two words. "Back up right now or I put a hole through her." The woman, Frank did not know her name yet, would not know it for another 3 minutes, did not flinch. She stood straight as a fence post and looked at Frank with an expression that was not fear. It was fury. It was the kind of fury a person carries when they have been in danger so many times that fear has simply burned itself out and left something harder and more stubborn in its place. "Don't you back up for him," she said, her voice low and even. "He is not going to shoot me. He knows what happens to him if he does." Cole pressed the barrel harder against her temple. "Shut your mouth, Delia, Delia." Frank locked that name away somewhere in his chest without even meaning to. "I said back up," Cole repeated, his eyes skipping between Frank and the door and the woman he was holding. Frank raised both hands slowly, the way a man does when he is buying himself time rather than showing submission. His dark eyes stayed on Cole with a kind of flat, measuring calm that had taken him years to develop, and that people who did not know him usually mistook for coldness. "Easy," Frank said. "I am just a man passing through. Let the woman go and we can all walk out of here standing upright." "You are not just a man passing through," Cole snapped. "I know who you are, Frank Hadley. Everybody knows who you are, and I know why you are here." The store was very quiet. Dust moved in the slant of morning light through the window. Somewhere outside a horse shifted and blew. Frank counted the distance between himself and Cole. He counted the angle of the gun. He counted the woman's position and the set of her shoulders, and the fact that her left hand, hanging at her side, had already curled into a fist around the edge of her apron. She was waiting for something. She was already planning something. "Then you know," Frank said carefully, "that I did not ride 200 miles to do anything to you, Cole." Something flickered in Cole's expression. Calculation. He had not expected Frank to use his name so easily, to strip away the pretense that Frank did not know exactly who he was dealing with. And in that single flicker of distraction, Delia Callahan dropped her weight straight down. She buckled at the knees with the deliberateness of a woman who has thought this through, who has perhaps thought it through 100 times in 100 dangerous moments, and Cole's gun hand swung upward with the sudden change in his grip, and Frank was already moving. He covered the distance in 3 strides, and his hand closed around Cole's wrist, and he drove it upward, and the gun went off into the ceiling with a sound like the end of the world in that small space, plaster dust raining down like snow. Cole fought for half a second and then he did not, because Frank Hadley had a way of applying pressure to a wrist that communicated very clearly that resistance would result in something breaking. Cole let go of the gun. Frank let go of Cole only long enough to step back and cover him. Delia was already on her feet. She had a broom handle in her hands. She had grabbed it off the floor on her way up, Frank noticed, the broom having been leaning against the counter close enough for her to reach, and she held it like she was fully prepared to use it. "Get out," she said to Cole. "Get out of my store and get out of this town before I go to Sheriff Pruitt and tell him everything you just did." Cole looked at the gun in Frank's hand. He looked at the woman with the broom handle. He made a decision that was, for once in his life, the intelligent one. He backed toward the door, hands raised, and then he was gone, and the bell above the door rang once and went silent. The dust settled. Frank looked at the woman named Delia Callahan. She was looking at him with those green eyes and that expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite suspicion and was, Frank thought, perhaps both things at once, layered on top of each other the way sediment layers in canyon walls. "You going to put that broom down?" he asked. "I have not decided yet," she said. He almost smiled. He had not almost smiled in a very long time. That was the beginning. But to understand what it meant, you had to go back further. You had to go back to the dark past that had driven Frank Hadley across half of Texas with vengeance in his heart and grief weighing every step his horse took. And you had to understand what redemption, Texas, was, and who Delia Callahan was, and what Cole Mercer and his employer had to do with all of it. You had to go back 3 years, to a different town, a different woman, and the night Frank Hadley had lost everything he had ever built. Her name had been Clara, and she had been Frank's wife, and in the autumn of 1879 she had been shot dead on the front porch of the ranch they had spent 4 years building together outside of a small town called Garver's Creek. Frank had been in town when it happened. He had come home to find her. He had not allowed himself to fall apart in any visible way, which was perhaps the most destructive thing he had ever done, because the grief had nowhere to go, and so it had turned into something else. It had turned into the kind of cold, absolute, purposeful rage that does not burn out. It only focuses. The man responsible was named Garrett Dole. He was a land broker and a criminal, and he operated out of a network of small towns along the western edge of Texas, running schemes that dispossessed ranchers and farmers of their property through fraud, intimidation, and, when necessary, violence. Clara had been killed because she had refused to sign over the deed to their land, because Frank had been in town, because Garrett Dole had sent men who were not supposed to kill anyone but who had gotten impatient. Frank had been investigating Dole for months before Clara's death, quietly, carefully, the way a man investigates when he knows the law will not help him. The law in that region had been Dole's law. After Clara, Frank had left Garver's Creek. He had spent 2 years gathering information, following threads, tracking the network of men who worked for Garrett Dole. He had become, in those 2 years, what the newspapers called an outlaw, though his actual crimes amounted to a few confrontations with Dole's men and one stolen horse that he had returned. He had a reputation that was partly earned, and partly the invention of men who wanted people to fear him before they got close enough to ask uncomfortable questions. Cole Mercer was the thread that had led Frank to redemption. Cole had been with Dole's organization for 2 years, and Frank had tracked him across 3 counties to this town, because Cole knew where Garrett Dole was operating from now, and that information was the last piece Frank needed. He had not expected a general store. He had not expected a woman being held at gunpoint. He had not expected Delia Callahan. He learned her name properly within the hour, because after Cole left and Frank stood in the middle of the general store with plaster dust on his shoulders and a pistol in his hand, Delia Callahan set the broom against the counter, straightened her apron with 2 efficient tugs, and said, "I am Delia Callahan. I own this store, and I would like to know who you are and why Cole Mercer recognizes you." Frank set the pistol on the counter between them. It was a gesture that meant something. He did not do it with everyone. "Frank Hadley," he said. Something moved in her expression. Recognition. Then something more complicated. "I have heard that name," she said carefully. "Most people have," he said without pride or apology. "They say you are dangerous." "Cole Mercer had a gun to your head," Frank said. "Dangerous is a word people use to mean a lot of different things." Delia studied him for a long moment. She was, Frank noticed now that the immediate crisis had passed, a striking woman. Not in a soft or decorative way, but in the way of someone who has been shaped by difficulty and has not been diminished by it. She was perhaps 27 or 28 years old, with dark copper hair pinned up in a practical braid and green eyes that had a particular quality of seeing clearly through surfaces. She had a small scar at the corner of her jaw, an old one, silvered by time. Her hands, when she set them flat on the counter, were the hands of a woman who did real work. "Why was Cole Mercer in my store?" she asked. "I was hoping you could tell me that," Frank said. Her expression shifted slightly. "He was looking for something. He came in 3 days ago asking about the property records I keep for the county assessor. I do some record keeping for the town. He wanted to see the deeds for the properties on the south side of Redemption." Frank went very still. "Why would he want that?" "I do not know," Delia said, "but I told him they were not available to him and I asked him to leave. He left then, but he came back this morning with that gun." She paused. "He said he would come back again with more men if I did not cooperate." "He is not going to come back," Frank said. "How can you be sure of that?" "Because Cole Mercer ran errands for Garrett Dole," Frank said, watching her face carefully. "And the last thing Cole Mercer wants is for me to keep following him." Delia's eyes sharpened. The name had landed. He could see it land. "Dole," she said, and her voice had changed. Not with fear, but with something that sounded like the recognition of a thing you have been dreading and half expecting for a long time. "You know that name," Frank said. "My father knew that name," she said, and her voice was quiet now. "My father owned land south of here, 80 acres, good land near a creek. He died 2 years ago. Heart trouble, the doctor said." She paused, and in that pause Frank heard everything she was not saying. "The land passed to me. I have been trying to hold on to it while running the store. A man came through 6 months ago, representing a land broker, offering to buy it at a price that was insulting. When I refused, he said I would regret it." Frank looked at the woman across the counter. He looked at the scar on her jaw and the set of her eyes and the steady, unmoved way she met his gaze, and he thought about Clara standing on a porch, refusing to sign papers, and he felt something in his chest tighten like a fist. "Your father's death," Frank said carefully. "Was it truly heart trouble?" Delia held his gaze for a long time. "I have never been certain," she said. The weight of that sentence settled between them like a stone dropped into deep water. Frank did not tell her everything that day. He told her enough, that Dole had a pattern, that the pattern involved identifying valuable land, approaching owners, and escalating from legal pressure to illegal pressure to violence when necessary. He told her that Cole had likely been sent to secure or destroy the property records to make future legal challenges more difficult. He told her that she was in genuine danger and that he intended to use what she knew to locate Dole. What he did not tell her was that sitting in the general store of Redemption, Texas, in the dusty late morning light, watching Delia Callahan's face as she absorbed information that she had probably suspected for years without anyone ever confirming it, he felt something shift in the frozen landscape of his interior that he had not felt in 3 years. It was something small. It was something he did not trust, but it was there. Delia offered him a room at the boarding house she co-owned with her neighbor, a widow named Mrs. Hannity, and Frank accepted, because he needed a base in Redemption, and because Cole Mercer was going to tell Garrett Dole that Frank Hadley was in town, and Frank needed to be ready when Dole responded. The boarding house was a 2-story frame building on the main street of Redemption, kept clean and running with the same practical efficiency that Delia applied to everything. Mrs. Hannity was a stout woman of 60 with a suspicious eye and an excellent hand at biscuits, and she regarded Frank Hadley with the frank wariness of a woman who had seen enough trouble to recognize what it looked like when it walked through her door. "He is not a criminal," Delia told her that evening in the kitchen, and Frank, passing in the hallway, heard it and stopped. "I am not saying he is," Mrs. Hannity said. "I am saying he brings criminal company. So does every man Garrett Dole sends to this town," Delia said, and her voice was hard as flint. "Frank Hadley is the first man who has come to this town who seems to want to stop him." Frank stood in the hallway for a moment longer than he should have. Then he moved on. Over the next several days, a careful, cautious thing began to unfold between Frank and Delia, constructed in the spaces between danger and practicality, growing up through the cracks in 2 people who had very good reasons to keep their walls high. Frank spent his days watching Cole Mercer, who had not left Redemption as Delia had demanded, but had taken up residence at the saloon, drinking in a way that suggested he was waiting for instructions rather than making his own decisions. Frank watched and waited and let Cole see him once a day, deliberately, to keep him nervous, because a nervous man waiting for instructions made mistakes. He also, because it was necessary, and because he told himself it was strictly necessary, spent a great deal of time at the general store. Delia ran the store alone. She had for 2 years since her father's death. Before that she had come west with her father from Missouri, having lost her mother to influenza when she was 16 and having, as she explained with the economical matter-of-factness that characterized the way she talked about her own life, simply gone with him because there was nothing else to go to. She had married briefly and badly at 21, a man named Callahan who had seemed steady and turned out to be neither steady nor kind, and she had been unmarried again at 23 when he had left for California and never returned. She had kept the name because she had gone to the trouble of learning to spell it. Frank learned all of this in pieces, over the course of mornings when he sat at the counter of the general store and they talked while she worked. He was not a man who talked easily about himself, and she was not a woman who pushed, and so the conversations had a particular quality, a kind of mutual careful excavation, each of them testing the ground before setting their weight on it. He told her about Clara on the 4th day, not all of it, just enough. He had not intended to tell her anything. He had been watching her restock the dry goods shelves, moving with a quiet, contained efficiency that he found himself watching rather more than was strictly necessary, and she had said, without turning around, "You came here for Garrett Dole specifically. This is personal." It was not a question. Frank was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. She came down from the step stool and turned to look at him. "Do you want to tell me?" And the strange thing was, when she asked it that way, not pressing, just opening a door and standing clear of it, he did. He told her about Clara, about the ranch, about coming home, about the 2 years since. He told it plainly, the way you tell something when you have carried it for so long that you have worn off all the extra weight and what is left is just the hard, true shape of it. Delia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry," she said, and she said it with a directness that was nothing like the reflexive condolences he had gotten from people over the years, nothing like the uncomfortable pity, the quick look away. She said it the way you say something you mean, meeting his eyes across the counter of the store, and somehow that was the thing that undid him, just slightly, just in the way that a single board in a fence coming loose does not collapse the fence but lets the wind through. He did not know what to do with that. So he looked down at the counter and after a moment said, "Tell me more about your father's land." She accepted the redirect without comment. That, too, he noticed. She spread the county maps on the counter. She had pulled them from the locked drawer where she had moved the property records after Cole's first visit, and showed him the parcel. 80 acres in the valley south of town, well-watered, with a creek running along the eastern boundary. She told him her father had filed the deed in 1875 when they first came to the territory, and that the deed was registered in both her father's name and her own. "So even with his death," Frank said, following the implication, "you hold clear title." "I do," she said, "which is why Cole was sent to find the records." Records could be made to disappear or be altered. A challenge to the title becomes much harder for me to fight. "Where are the originals?" "Filed with the county seat in Hargrove," she said, "but a certified copy lives here in that drawer, and I have another copy in the safe at the back." Frank looked at her. "You anticipated this." "I anticipated something," she said carefully. "After my father died and the first offer came, I had a feeling. I made extra copies. I told my lawyer in Hargrove." She paused. "My father did not die of heart trouble. I am more certain of that now than I was before you came." The words landed between them with a terrible, familiar weight. "I will find proof," Frank said. It came out harder than he intended, more like a vow than an observation, and he saw her notice that. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Frank, whatever you find and whatever you plan to do when you find Dole, I want you to remember something." "What?" "I want justice," she said. "Real justice, not vengeance, not more blood. I have had enough of things being solved with violence in this county." He looked at her for a long time. "I cannot promise you clean hands," he said, "but I can promise you that I did not ride 200 miles to become the same thing as the man I am after." She held his gaze. Something passed between them in that silence, not yet declared, not yet named but present, the way a change in weather is present before the first drop of rain. Present in the air and in the quality of light and in the way two people who have been careful and contained suddenly become very aware of how little space there is between them. "All right," she said finally. She folded the maps. "I will make coffee." Over the following week Frank gathered intelligence with the methodical focus of a man who has been doing this for years. He learned that Garrett Dole had a temporary office in a town called Mesa Fork, 20 miles south of Redemption, from which he was running a scheme to consolidate land along a proposed rail line through the territory. The Southern Pacific had surveyors through the region the previous year, and the route that was being planned ran directly through the valley where Delia's 80 acres sat, and through 6 other parcels currently owned by small ranchers and settlers who had been receiving the same kind of pressure Delia had received. This was larger than Frank had understood it to be. This was not just personal. This was a systematic campaign of dispossession affecting an entire community, and the men running it had money and legal cover and connections to officials in at least 2 counties. He told Delia what he had found. They were sitting on the front porch of the boarding house in the early evening, the sky going that particular deep blue over the western hills that it got in Texas in late spring, the air still and warm and smelling of dust and wild sage. Mrs. Hannity had brought out lemonade with the air of a woman who was participating in something against her better judgment, but was going to do it properly if she did it at all. Delia sat in the other chair with her hands wrapped around her glass and listened to Frank lay out everything he had learned, and when he finished she sat quiet for a long moment looking at the hills. "There are other families," she said, "6 that I know of, possibly more. They need to know," she said. "They need to know what is being done to them, and they need to know they are not alone in it." "Agreed," Frank said, "but moving too fast will tip Dole off. He has people watching." "I know the families," Delia said. "I know all of them. The Hernandez family has the parcel on the east side of the valley. The Peterson family is to the north. The others I can name." She turned to look at him. "I can talk to them. I have been talking to them. They trust me." "That could put you at risk." "Cole Mercer already had a gun to my head," she said, and the calm practicality of it stopped him cold. "I am already at risk. I would rather be at risk doing something useful." He looked at her in the fading light. There was something in the particular quality of her courage that struck him differently than he expected. It was not recklessness. It was not bravado. It was the courage of someone who has calculated the fear clearly and decided to move forward anyway, and that was, Frank thought, the rarest and most genuine form of it. "Then we work together," he said. And something in her expression shifted, just slightly, like a door opening a precise quarter inch. "Yes," she said, "I think we do." What followed was 2 weeks of careful, intricate, occasionally dangerous work that drew them together in the particular way that shared purpose draws people, not through proximity alone, but through the experience of watching each other think and decide and act under pressure, which is the truest way of knowing a person. They met with the affected families in small groups, quietly, at the store and at the boarding house, and once at the Hernandez family's kitchen table, where Maria Hernandez served them strong coffee and her husband Pablo spread his own maps on the table and showed them the letters he had received from Dole's men. And in his dark, steady eyes Frank saw something that he recognized from looking in a mirror. A man trying to protect what he had built and finding the walls closing in. Frank felt a cold anger settle into his bones that was different from the personal, grief-driven rage that had driven him this far. This was cleaner. This was about more than Clara now, and the recognition of that fact, the expansion of what he was fighting from a personal score to something larger, did something to his interior that he could not quite name. He talked to Delia about it that night, walking back from the Hernandez ranch in the blue dusk, their horses moving slowly on the road. "I did not come here for them," he said. "I came here for Dole. I came here for Clara." "And now," Delia said. "Now I cannot pretend the rest of it is not real," he said. She was quiet for a moment, riding easily beside him in the way of someone who has ridden all her life. "Does that bother you, that it is larger than you planned?" "No," he said, and was surprised to find that it was true. "It just means it matters for more reasons." She glanced at him sideways, and in the low light he could see the edge of something in her expression, something that was not quite a smile but was in the same family. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I do not know exactly," she said. "Someone harder, more closed off." "I am fairly closed off," he said. "Yes," she said, "but you keep opening the door and standing in it, which is not the same thing as being closed." He thought about that for the rest of the ride back. He thought about it later, lying awake in the small room at the boarding house, listening to the night sounds of the town and trying to understand what was happening to him. He was 32 years old. He had been 32 years old since February and had not really noticed the birthday. He had spent 3 years dismantling himself into something functional and purposeful and unemotional, and he had done a thorough job of it, thorough enough that he had genuinely believed there was nothing left in him to feel what he was apparently feeling now, standing in the particular doorway Delia Callahan had just described. He was not sure when it had started. He thought perhaps it had started in the first moment, with the way she had dropped straight down when she needed to, the courage of that, the intelligence and the refusal to be helpless. Or perhaps it had started when she said she was sorry and meant it. Or perhaps it had been gradual, accumulated over the weeks of maps and coffee and evening conversations, the slow construction of something he had not been trying to build. He did not know what to do with it. He had come here with a score to settle. He had not come here for this. The crisis that forced everything into the open came on a Wednesday morning 12 days after his arrival, in the form of Cole Mercer, and 4 men Frank did not recognize riding into redemption, with the particular focused purpose of men who have been given specific instructions. Frank saw them from the second-floor window of the boarding house and was downstairs and out the back door before they reached the main street. He went through the alley behind the dry goods stores and came up behind the general store and knocked on the back door. 3 quick knocks, and then 2, which was the signal he and Delia had established the week before. She opened the door immediately, which meant she had already seen them. 5 men, she said. Cole and 4 I have never seen. Same, Frank said. Where are the records? Safe in the back, she said. I sent Thomas Ramirez to find Sheriff Pruitt 20 minutes ago. Thomas Ramirez was the 12-year-old son of one of the affected families who had been helping around the store. Sheriff Pruitt was a problem because Frank was not sure which side of this situation the sheriff had decided to be on. In a Dole-controlled county, sheriffs were a variable he never assumed in his favor. I need you to go to Mrs. Hannity's, Frank said. Right now, take the spare copies of all the records. I'm not leaving the store, Delia said. Delia, they are coming for the records and they are coming for me, she said, and her voice was absolutely steady, and Frank simultaneously wanted to argue with her and understood completely why she would not move. If I run, they know I am scared. If I stay, they have to deal with me publicly in the middle of the main street with half the town watching. She was right. He recognized it and hated it simultaneously. Then you stay behind the counter and you do not give them anything, he said, and I stay where they can see me. That will make them escalate. Yes, he said, that is the idea. What happened over the next half hour was the most carefully managed confrontation Frank had ever navigated, which was saying something given the situations he had been in over the previous 3 years. Cole and his men came into the store with the practiced authority of people who were used to having it go their way, and they found Delia Callahan behind her counter with her arms folded, and Frank Hadley leaning against the wall beside the door with his arms folded too, And the arrangement of those two people in that space communicated something to Cole Mercer that Frank could see landing in his expression like a slap. "We are here for the county records," Cole said. "Those records belong to the county," Delia said. "You are not the county, you are not the sheriff, you are not a judge, you have no legal authority in this store." "Where is Hadley going?" one of Cole's men said suddenly, because Frank had pushed off the wall and was walking toward the door with a casual, unhurried movement that looked like indifference but was not. "Getting the sheriff," Frank said pleasantly and walked out. He did not have to get the sheriff. Sheriff Pruitt was already coming up the street, and behind him, this was the moment Frank had been working toward for 12 days. The thing he had set in motion piece by piece were Pablo Hernandez and 2 other landowners and their wives, walking in a group with the particular weight of people who have decided they are not going to be afraid anymore. And behind them was the Redemption Weekly Gazette's editor, a nervous young man named Henry Galt, who had agreed to be present, because Frank had privately handed him a sealed letter 3 days ago, and told him to open it and print every word if anything happened to Frank in the interim. Cole Mercer and his 4 men came out of the store, saw the assembled town, saw the sheriff, saw Frank standing in the middle of the street, and saw Delia Callahan come out behind them and take up a position to Frank's left, and made a calculation that turned out to be the first intelligent calculation Cole had made in his entire association with Garrett Dole. They mounted their horses and they left. The confrontation that had been building for 12 days ended not with a shootout, but with the organized, documented witness presentation to Sheriff Pruitt of the evidence that Frank, Delia, and the affected families had assembled fraudulent contracts, forged letters, the record of intimidation and threats, and the documented pattern connecting all of it to Garrett Dole's operation. Henry Galt wrote down every word. Sheriff Pruitt looked at the evidence for a long time. He was a man of 50 with a face like old leather and careful eyes, and Frank watched him and waited to see which way this would fall. "I've been getting pressure from men connected to Dole for 6 months, Pruitt said finally, not to Frank but to the assembled group, and particularly to Pablo Hernandez, to whom he seemed to feel he owed a specific acknowledgement. "I want you to know that I have not acted on that pressure. I have also not acted against it because I did not have enough. Now I have enough." He looked at Frank. "I know your record," he said. "I know what they say about you, and I know what is actually documented. You have been operating in a gray area, Hadley." "I know it," Frank said. "You helped me bring in Dole, and I will write a letter to the district marshal stating exactly what I observed here and the contribution you made to it," Pruitt said. "I cannot promise you a pardon. I can promise you an honest account." Frank looked at him for a moment. "That is all I have ever asked for," he said. Garrett Dole was arrested in Mesa Fork 4 days later, with Sheriff Pruitt and 2 deputies and Frank Hadley, and somewhat surprisingly, Pablo Hernandez and another rancher named Will Peterson, who had refused to be left out of it. The arrest was not without incident. 2 of Dole's men resisted, and 1 deputy took a graze to his arm, but Garrett Dole himself, when he found himself surrounded and outgunned and looking at a stack of documented evidence that included testimony from Cole Mercer, who had, faced with the alternative, decided to cooperate with the sheriff, did not resist. He was a man who had operated through other people's violence rather than his own, and without the protection of those people, he was simply a frightened, pale-faced schemer who sat down in a chair and asked to speak to a lawyer. Frank looked at him across the office in Mesa Fork and waited for the satisfaction he had been building toward for 3 years. He waited for the closing of something, the sense of completion, the feeling of the score being settled. What he felt was surprisingly quiet. Not empty, not the hollow disappointment he had been warned about by no one, because no one had told him this would happen, but quieter than he had expected. More like putting something down than like finding something. Clara's death would not be undone. That was the thing that grief never told you about revenge, Frank thought. It pretended to be a substitute for the thing that could not be recovered, but it was not. It was only itself. It was only Garrett Dole in a chair, looking smaller than he had in 3 years of Frank's imagination. He turned and walked out of the office and found his horse, and started the ride back toward Redemption. He was halfway back when he heard hoofbeats behind him and turned to find Delia Callahan pulling up alongside him on her chestnut mare, slightly out of breath, her hair coming loose from its braid in the wind. "You left without saying anything," she said. "I needed to think," he said. They rode together in silence for a while. The evening was coming on, the sky over the hills going pink and amber, and the air had that clean, dry quality it got in Texas in early summer when the heat had baked off the moisture, but before the full bake of midsummer set in. It was a beautiful evening, and Frank was very aware of it in a way he had not been aware of evenings for a long time. "Did you get what you came for?" Delia asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Part of it," he said. "The part that can be gotten." She understood what he meant. He could see it in her profile, the slight, acknowledging dip of her chin. "And the rest," she said. He looked at her. She was not looking at him yet. She was looking at the road ahead with that composed, forward-looking quality she had, and her hands were easy on the reins, and there was a strand of copper hair loose against her cheek. And Frank Hadley, outlaw, widower, man who had spent 3 years dismantling his own heart in the service of a purpose, felt the words come up in him with the simple, unavoidable clarity of something that has been growing underground for weeks and finally pushes through. "The rest," he said, "I did not expect to find. But I found it." Delia turned her head to look at him. Her green eyes were steady and direct and completely unsurprised and completely open, and he thought that this was perhaps the most courageous thing about her. Not the bravery in danger, not the refusal to be moved by threats, but this, the willingness to meet something honestly when it arrived. "Frank," she said. "I know," he said. "I know I am not a simple situation. I know I came here with a purpose that had nothing to do with—" He stopped, then made himself continue. "I know that what I was is not what a person builds a life around. What you were," she said carefully, "past tense. I would like it to be," he said. "If there is something here worth staying for." He looked at her. "Is there?" The road was very quiet. The horses walked slowly, unhurried, as if they too were waiting. "Frank," Delia said, and her voice was softer now, the hardness entirely gone, "you have been sitting in my store every morning for 2 weeks. You have helped me protect my land and the land of 6 families in this valley. You told me about Clara, and you did not expect me to fix it, which was the correct thing to not expect. You nearly got shot twice in my vicinity and did not complain about it." A pause. "And you put your gun down on my counter the very first day." He waited. "Yes," she said simply. "There is something here worth staying for." He had not realized how much of him had been waiting for that until the waiting stopped. Something shifted, not the dramatic seismic shift of a man being transformed, but the quieter, more permanent shift of a man finding his footing in new ground. "I should warn you," he said, "that I am better at this than I seem. I have just been out of practice." She gave a quiet laugh, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was warm and clear and entirely unguarded. "That is a very interesting warning," she said. They rode the rest of the way back to Redemption in a companionable silence that was different in quality from the silences they had shared before, looser and warmer, with a different kind of ease in it. It was not simple after that. The aftermath of Dole's arrest unfolded over the following weeks with the grinding, complicated machinery of frontier justice, which was the kind of justice that operated in fits and starts and required constant attention and occasional strategic pushes to keep moving in the right direction. Frank stayed in Redemption. He told himself initially that he was staying because the legal process required his testimony, which was true. He told himself later that he was staying because the affected families needed support through the property disputes that were now being formally adjudicated, which was also true. By the end of the first month, he had stopped inventing reasons and simply stayed, which was its own kind of honesty. Garrett Dole was indicted on charges of fraud, land theft, and conspiracy, and Cole Mercer's testimony combined with the documentary evidence Frank and Delia had assembled proved decisive. The district court in Hargrove began formal proceedings in July. The fraudulent claims against the affected properties were invalidated. Pablo Hernandez and his family kept their land. The Petersons kept theirs. Delia's 80 acres in the South Valley were confirmed as hers without challenge. The question of Frank's legal status was settled in a manner that was not perfectly clean but was, as Sheriff Prout had promised, honest. The letter Prout wrote to the district marshal described Frank's role in dismantling Dole's operation with specificity and credit, and the district marshal, a practical man named Theodore Briggs who cared considerably more about results than about the methods by which they were achieved, arranged a formal dismissal of the vague and poorly documented charges that had followed Frank for 2 years. It was not a parade. It was a piece of paper that said, in the dry legal language of the frontier court system, that the outstanding complaints against one Frank Hadley of no fixed address had been reviewed and found insufficient and were hereby dismissed. Frank held the paper in the office of the Redemption Postal Station and read it twice and then folded it with precise, careful movements and put it in his shirt pocket. He stood for a moment looking at the opposite wall. Then he went to find Delia. She was at the store. She was always at the store. He had come to find this entirely reliable and somehow deeply comforting, the way the store was always there and she was always in it, the particular smell of coffee and dry goods, and the dusty sunlit quiet of the place that was now as familiar to him as any place had been since the ranch at Garver's Creek. She looked up when he came in and read his face immediately. "It came through," she said. "It came through," he said. She came around the counter and stood in front of him, and he thought she might say something practical, something measured and appropriate, because that was frequently her way. Instead, she put her hands flat against his chest and looked up at him with those direct green eyes and said, "I am so glad." He put his hands over hers. The warmth of it moved through him with the slow, deep certainty of something fundamental. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I have been thinking about the South Valley land," he said. 80 acres is a fair piece. With water access and good grass it could carry cattle. I have ranching experience. I know what I am doing with land like that." Delia was watching him with an expression of careful, contained attention that he recognized as the expression she got when she was following an argument to where it was going rather than where it had started. "You are talking about helping me develop the land," she said. "I am talking about more than that," Frank said. "I am not good at circling around things, so I am going to say it plainly. I want to stay in Redemption. I want to stay because of you. I want to build something here with you, if you will let me. I am not the same man I was 3 years ago, and I am not the man I was 3 months ago when I rode in here either. And what I am now is a man who wants to ask you if you would be willing to let him be your husband." The silence that followed was the most suspended silence Frank had ever stood in. Delia looked at him for a long time. He watched her process it, watched the quick, precise movement of thought behind her eyes, and he was not afraid of the processing because he had learned to trust it. Her thinking always landed somewhere real. "Frank," she said finally, "I was married once before and it was a bad experience." "I know," he said. "I have been entirely my own person for 5 years and I have become very accustomed to that." "I know that too," he said. "I would not ask you to be anything other than what you are. I would ask to be beside it." She was quiet for another moment. "You have a particular way of saying things," she said. "Is that a yes?" She made a sound that was both a laugh and a breath, and then she said, "Yes, that is a yes." He kissed her then, in the middle of the general store, in the slant of afternoon light. And it was both exactly what he had been working toward without letting himself know it, and entirely nothing he had planned, which was, he thought, exactly right. They were married in August of 1882, on a hot, bright morning at the Redemption Baptist Church, with Mrs. Hannity weeping openly in the front pew and Sheriff Prout standing up with Frank, because Frank had not known, until he was asked, that he had come to regard the man as a friend. Pablo and Maria Hernandez came with their 4 children and brought tamales wrapped in corn husks for the celebration afterward, and Will Peterson brought a fiddle and played until the stars came out. And Henry Galt from the Gazette wrote a piece about it that was considerably more flowery than Frank was comfortable with, but that Delia read 3 times with a small private smile she tried to hide and did not quite manage. They built the ranch on the South Valley land that fall. Frank had a clear, practical vision for it, and Delia had strong opinions about all of it, and the combination of those two things resulted in several vigorous arguments and a structure that turned out, when it was finished, to be very good. The house was solid frame construction with a real fireplace and a kitchen that was both functional and beautiful, because Delia had very clear ideas about kitchens. The barn went up in October with help from half the town, because, in Redemption in 1882, a barn raising was still a community event, and there was considerable goodwill toward the Hadleys specifically, given what Frank and Delia had done together for the Valley families. Frank and Pablo Hernandez established a partnership over the cattle operation, sharing grazing rights and working the drives together, and this arrangement worked because they were both men who respected work more than they respected the appearance of ownership, and because Maria Hernandez and Delia had a friendship that had grown during the crisis months into something deep and easy and real, built on the particular bond of two women who have faced serious things together and know the quality of each other. The store remained Delia's. She kept it through the cattle operation and through what came afterward, because the store was not just a business to her. It was the thing she had built when she had nothing else, and it was the place where she had met the people of Redemption most honestly, and it was, she told Frank once, the place where she had first decided he was worth trusting, which made it sacred in a particular private way. In the spring of 1883, Delia told Frank that she was expecting their child. She told him on a morning in the kitchen over coffee, with the directness that was her way, and Frank Hadley sat very still for a moment, and then set down his cup, and looked at his wife with an expression that Delia would describe later to Maria as the most unguarded she had ever seen on his face, as if every layer had been peeled back all at once and she was seeing straight to something clean and undefended. "Are you all right?" he asked, because that was his first question, not triumph or excitement, but the immediate orientation toward her, and she loved him completely in that moment, in a way she had been loving him gradually, and then suddenly all at once for months. "I am very all right," she said, and he got up from the table and came to her and held her, and she put her face against his neck, and they stayed like that for a long time in the warm kitchen with the morning coming in through the window. Their son was born in November of 1883, a substantial, dark-haired boy who arrived with the aggressive impatience of someone who has been waiting and is done with waiting, and who, within his first hour of existence, looked at Frank with unfocused dark eyes and proceeded to rearrange every remaining interior structure Frank had been maintaining with such careful effort for the last several years. They named him James. James Arthur Hadley, after Frank's father and Delia's father respectively, which felt like the right way to carry both of their histories forward into something new. The legal proceedings against Garrett Dole concluded in the winter of 1883 with a sentence of 12 years in the federal prison at Huntsville for fraud and conspiracy, and additional charges relating to the deaths of several individuals, including, as it eventually emerged from Cole Mercer's full testimony, Delia's father Patrick Callahan, whose heart trouble had been assisted by a substance added to his water by one of Dole's men. A revelation that came out during the trial, and that caused Delia to sit very quietly for an entire evening, and then cry for the first time about her father's death. Really cry, not the controlled, contained grief she had been managing for 2 years, but the real grief that had been waiting under it. Frank sat with her through all of it, through the whole evening and into the night, and did not try to fix it or reduce it or redirect it, only stayed, which was what she needed, and in the morning she was tired and red-eyed and more at peace than she had been since before her father died, and she looked at Frank over the breakfast table and said, "Thank you," and he understood exactly what she meant. Cole Mercer received 2 years of reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony and was released in 1885, after which he left Texas entirely and was never heard of in redemption again. Whether he genuinely reformed himself was something Frank and Delia occasionally speculated about on evenings, not with bitterness, but with the mild philosophical curiosity of people who have moved far enough past a thing to wonder about it from a distance. The spring of 1884 brought good cattle prices and a mild winter, and the news that the Southern Pacific would in fact run a line through the territory, though the route was adjusted from what Dole had been planning around, adjusted because the original route had been surveyed under his corrupt influence, and the new survey placed it slightly north, which meant that the valley properties were not directly impacted in the way Dole had intended. The rail spur that eventually came through Redemption in 1886 was an enormous benefit to the community, opening markets and reducing the cost of supplies, and Frank and Pablo Hernandez were among the first ranchers in the county to ship cattle by rail rather than drive. The Hadley Ranch grew. The cattle operation expanded with careful management to 3 times its original size by 1886, and they brought on 2 hands young men named Rafe and Carlos who had grown up in the territory and knew the land and who were, within a year, as much a part of the working life of the place as the buildings. Delia continued to run the store, which she expanded in 1885 by purchasing the adjacent storefront and adding a dry goods and hardware section that served the growing population of Redemption and the surrounding ranches. In the summer of 1885 she was expecting again, and this time Frank was a different kind of calm about it, still entirely attentive, still oriented first toward her, but without the stunned quality of the first time, with more of the ease of a man who has learned the territory. Their daughter arrived in January of 1886, a serene and watchful baby with Delia's green eyes who regarded the world from the very beginning with a quality of composed assessment that made everyone who met her say, with great accuracy, that she was entirely her mother's daughter. They named her Clara, after Frank's first wife. Delia had offered it, had thought about it, and then offered it directly and clearly, because she was that kind of person, and because she understood that Frank carried Clara with him, not as a wound that competed with the present, but as a person who had mattered and always would, and that naming their daughter for her was a way of acknowledging that the past was part of them and did not have to be hidden to make room for the present. Frank had looked at her when she offered it and been unable to speak for a moment. When he could, he said, "Are you sure?" "I am very sure," she said. And so they had Clara, and James had a sister he was enormously proprietorial about from the beginning, and the house on the South Valley land was full in a way that Frank, riding home one evening from the North Pasture in the long summer light of 1886, found himself simply stopping his horse to observe the light in the windows, the sound of Delia's voice from somewhere inside, the distant sound of James running in the yard, the smell of wood smoke and supper, and the particular dry, sweet smell of the Texas evening, and the solid, real, permanent weight of a life that was his. He sat there on his horse for a full minute. Then he rode in. In the years that followed, Redemption continued to grow and change, as frontier towns did in that era, the wild and lawless edges slowly filing down into something more settled and ordinary, which was a loss of one kind of life and the beginning of another. Frank sometimes felt the ghost of his former self in the way he still read a room when he walked into it, still noted exits and risks as automatically as breathing, still had a quality of contained alertness that Mrs. Hannity, who had become something between a grandmother and a general to the Hadley household, called his wolf look. But the wolf look was not the whole of him anymore. That was the thing that surprised him most consistently, not that he had changed, but that the change had not felt like loss. The man who had ridden into Redemption on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882 with a score to settle had been running on grief and purpose, which were powerful fuels but narrow ones. And the man he was now ran on something that had more colors in it, more textures, more reasons to be in a specific place on a specific evening watching the light change over specific hills. He told Delia this once in the quiet of their bedroom in the winter of 1887, lying awake in the way they sometimes did when the children were settled and the house was still and the conversation could go anywhere. "I thought I knew what I was riding toward," he said. "I thought I had the whole map." "And," she said, "and the map was missing most of the territory," he said. She was quiet for a moment. He could feel her thinking, the particular quality of her thinking that he had come to know as well as his own, quick and direct, and never satisfied with the easy surface answer. "Frank," she said, "do you think you would have found your way here without the score to settle? Without Dole, without all of it?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "I think I needed to be pointed here by something. I just did not know that what I was being pointed toward was not only what I was angry about. Grief points us sometimes," she said quietly, "not always toward destruction." He turned his head to look at her in the dark room, the shape of her against the dim light of the curtained window, and felt the deep, uncomplicated truth of how much he loved her. Not the early heat of it, which had been real and was still real, but the accumulated, practiced, daily love of people who have built things together and held things together and grown into each other over years. "I love you," he said, because he believed in saying it plainly. "I know," she said, and then, because she too believed in saying it plainly, "I love you too." Henry Galt at the Gazette wrote a piece in 1887 about the development of the valley properties and the cattle operations, and the ways in which the community had changed since the events of 1882, and he asked Frank for a statement, which Frank gave in the economical way he gave everything. "I came to this town to find a man who had done a serious wrong," Frank said. "I found him. I also found a reason to stay, which I had not expected, and which has turned out to be the better part of the whole enterprise." Galt printed it verbatim, and Delia read it at the store counter the morning the paper came out, and her expression was that particular one that Frank had come to treasure above almost all others. The small, genuine, unperformative smile that she got when something moved her and she was not bothering to hide it. She cut the piece out and kept it in the locked drawer where she used to keep the property records, the drawer that was now full of different things, letters from Maria Hernandez and photographs, and small documents and mementos that were the accumulated record of a life that was full and specific and entirely real. James Hadley turned 5 in the autumn of 1888, and had, by this point, the complete confidence of a child who has been consistently and genuinely loved, which expressed itself as an alarming willingness to walk up to any person or animal he had never met and introduce himself without any apparent fear. He was his father's son in the set of his jaw and his mother's son in the directness of his eyes, and entirely himself in everything else. Clara was 2.5 and had developed, right on schedule, the absolute certainty of personhood that 2-year-olds develop, and she and James had established a sibling dynamic that involved equal amounts of fierce loyalty and fierce competition, and that Delia managed with a calm efficiency that Frank deeply admired. On a Sunday morning in October of 1888, Frank Hadley stood at the kitchen window of the house he had built on the land that had once been targeted by a man now 7 years into a 12-year federal sentence, and watched his son chase his daughter across the yard in the thin autumn sunlight while Delia came up behind him with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without being asked, the way you do things for people whose rhythms you know. He took the coffee. She stood beside him at the window. They watched the children. The morning was quiet and gold and full of the particular quality of peace that is not the absence of struggle, because the struggle had been real, and some of it was permanent, and the loss of Clara, his first wife, was still a real thing that lived in him and always would, but was rather the presence of something that has been built with intention and maintained with love and that stands, solid and specific in the real world. "I need to check the north fence line this afternoon," Frank said. "Pablo is coming for supper," Delia said. "I will be back before then." "I know you will," she said. They stood at the window together in the autumn morning, drinking their coffee, watching their children run in the yard, and the story of the man who had come to town to settle a score was settled now, fully and permanently, into something he had not expected and could not have planned. Into this house, this land, this woman, these children, this quiet and unhurried Sunday morning that was ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure, and that was, without question, the most necessary and true thing he had ever found. Outside, James caught Clara and they both fell in the grass laughing, and Delia made a small sound beside Frank that was equal parts exasperation and love, and Frank set down his coffee and went to the door, and the morning opened up around all of them, bright and wide and entirely their own.